Welcome to Issued for Construction. I'm your host, Jonathan Jacobs, and today I've got with me a gentleman who is rather synonymous with the architecture scene in Canada, and in many ways, I guess, around the globe. Today I've got with me Alex Bozikovic from the Globe and Mail. Alex, thanks for joining.
Hey, great to be here.
So Alex and I connected a little while back, and we had lunch and we got to chat, and it's to me one of the most important parts of doing all of this is that you get to actually develop a little bit of rapport with people in advance. And for those of you listening, you probably have read something that Alex has written. So I want to thank you for taking time away from what you do to do this. Media to media.
Nice. always happy to chat, and I like the show. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, I appreciate doing it. So before we get into Alex's background, I want to plant a seed for something we discuss later in this episode. Alex and I dive deep into the sensory experiences of cities, specifically how food and aroma and cafe culture shape the places we love, from right here in Toronto all the way to high-low food scene in Tokyo. Food culture is an incredibly immersive part of our lives, and those sensory experiences are just as significant when you bring them into your own home. That's where an incredible company like Kaplan's Appliances comes in. Kaplan's has been servicing the Toronto community and the GTA for generations. My grandparents knew about them, my parents used them, and now I have them in my house with their products as well. Just like many of you listening. That kind of legacy doesn't happen by accident. It happens by intention. Kaplan's is led by people with a clear vision for the relevance and importance of relationships. They support those relationships by providing the highest quality brands on the market. Names like Sub-Zero, Wolf, Miele, Fisher & Paykel, Jenn-Air, and La Cornue. And for your outdoor spaces, again, they carry Wolf and Sub-Zero, but also DCS Outdoor, Lynx, Urban Bonfire, and more. If you want to learn what it looks like to be a part of a truly generational relationship with a supplier, it is worth connecting with Kaplan's. The experience is unlike any other supplier in the space. Head over to the liner notes to connect with them direct, or you can email me and I will set you up with an introduction. That introduction will lead to a beautiful lunch prepared for you in-house with their chef, giving you the chance to understand and learn exactly what this relationship can look like to support you, your business, your clients, or you as a homeowner. Now, let's get back to Alex. So let's just get off into it and let's talk about like where were you born? And two, what was your family like? And three, what were your interests? What kind of person were you as a little child?
You always like to go deep. In my work, I don't often talk about myself in direct ways.
Yes.
It's not generally how I'm built, but I am from Toronto and born in North York, raised there and in the suburbs. And so I think I've spent most of my life in more than half of my life in the city and almost all of my life in this region. So I am pretty closely tied to this place. So, I mean, that's one of the things that drives me day to day is that I am, I know the place well. I've studied it, I care about it. I understand.
You experience it?
I experience it from day to day, myself and with my family and with friends. And, I have a sort of a deep love for the place and also kind of a sense of the ways in which I think it could be better. So that's one of the things that really drives me, in a lot of the work that I do. Family. I grew up in a fairly, average middle-class family. My father was an immigrant. My mom was born here. And I think, one sort of aspect of my upbringing that I think is sort of Toronto specific, and that's interesting is, is living in apartments. My first home was in an apartment building near Jane and Finch, downstairs from my immigrant grandparents, who went on to live in another apartment not too far away around Jane and Eglinton for, 30 years. And my other grandparents across the city in Scarborough, also lived or retired into an apartment tower.
Both grandparents were here.
Yeah, both grandparents were here and in apartments.
Yeah.
So my two branches of my family were, immigrants who didn't have a lot and, sort of very middle class Scarborough people, and both of them ended up in these slab apartment towers. So, for on the weekends, you'd go and visit, my grandparents on the 10th floor on one side of the city or the 16th floor on the other.
Yeah.
And that was entirely normal to me, as it is for, a million people who live in this region. Right. And so I think while we lived mostly in houses while I was growing up, I had a fairly normal kind of suburban upbringing. That experience of the city, I think, and of that variety was baked in a little bit and gave me perhaps a slightly broader experience of different ways of living than a lot of the other people who wind up in jobs like the one I have.
Right. And were you always growing up, were you interested in what you currently practice, or was this like, and if not, what were your interests? So what did you do? Were you an artistic child? Were you scientific? Were you exploring the outdoors and like, what were you like?
I mean, I was a pretty bookish kid, very energetic, did some sports. I loved music, as I still do. It was very important to me, but, a pretty bookish kid. And my road to, being interested in places and in cities and in buildings is a little bit sort of meandering. I studied English and did a master's and even started a doctorate in English, largely because I liked books and I liked English class. And as a young person, like a lot of young people, I didn't really know where I was going. But journalism always grabbed me. I loved to read the newspaper. My parents, used to tell embarrassing stories about me reading, the editorials in the newspaper when I was 6 years old. Right. So, I was that kid. And so going into journalism is something that I was always interested in doing.
Sorry, I'm interrupting, but like, what was it about, like, specifically at that age, the editorials that you were attracted to?
Who knows? I was, a smart, bookish kid, and, it was a window into the outside world, right?
Yeah,
and we grew up, it was the Toronto Star in my household, which was, in the 80s was an enormous newspaper. It had a lot of stuff in it, right? The kids today have no idea. And I think, learning about what was, going on outside the walls of my house, grabbed me, that connection to the world and to things that mattered, I suppose. And so flash forward to, my years out of university and out of grad school, I went into journalism, and as I became a journalist, I just decided to make this my thing. I sort of figured out in university increasingly that I was really interested in architecture and in cities and in places, even though I didn't really study those subjects. And I just...
Where did you study?
I studied English at U of T, and then at the City University of New York. And so architecture, other than one course, is really something I didn't really have any training in the field or in landscape or in planning. But the good news about being a journalist is that you can just call people up and ask them questions, and they will tell you things. That's the job. And so in my 20s, I started initially as a freelancer to do that and to sort of learn effectively on the job and to read and to acquire a sort of intellectual grounding for why, what these people were talking about when they talked about, massing and fenestration and all of this weird jargon. And so it was almost an apprenticeship as a journalist to, learn how to do the work, and then also to sort of understand this bigger picture about the city and the region and about architecture and its sort of intellectual foundations. And then eventually, in my career, I've moved into thinking about planning and housing politics and certainly about landscape. So they're kind of the lens keeps getting bigger.
We'll go deeper into that later.
Yeah.
But I want to go back a little bit before university and where you've just gone, because we talked before we turned our mics on about how, like track and other things that you were really interested in. What else was there? You said musical.
Yeah.
Like what? What do you play?
I mean, I've always been, very interested in music, and I studied piano. I played some piano. I played drums reasonably well. I played classical percussion when I was in high school. And music has always been, one of the things that really makes me tick, together with, storytelling and words and narrative and poetry, and then, policy and government and all of the things that I engage with now.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think I was, but above all, I mean, I think words have always been my strong suit.
Yeah. Fair.
I am not, it's interesting to say this because my work is so, this world that I work in is so visual, right? But I've never been particularly talented as an artist. I've always been very interested in visual art as well. It's another deep interest of mine. But there's a certain kind of aptitude I've developed that is being able to remember things that visually, to make connections between things visually, to recognize that one thing is like another thing or draws upon another thing, which is interesting. And I've talked to other people in the architecture world, and there's certain kinds of I've reflected on this because I don't think I'd be a great designer. I don't think I have the sort of pure visual aptitude, right, or compositional aptitude to be a designer in a pure sense. But it's a lot of other stuff that goes with it, and making connections, you're seeing patterns, putting things together, understanding how things, in a visual, formal sense as well as in other ways. That's kind of I guess that's really how I'm built. And so I've found this strange path, it's a weird job that I've got.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because like I always love visual arts. I did them all my life.
Yeah.
But there is artistry to playing instruments.
Yeah.
There's artistry to when you think of like Usain Bolt
Mm-hmm.
running, his motion is art.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways to be able to engage in some form of that type of creativity that
Yes,
they are visual arts. They're just different than the traditional visual art.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I have a lot of respect for athletes, and I think the sort of through line is craft and
Yes.
Commitment to one's craft and commitment to paying attention to and paying attention to something and working with it. And that's really I guess what I aspire to do, and I think what is crucial to doing this kind of work is attention, paying attention, understanding things, reading, doing that work to understand the historical contexts that shape the things that you're looking at. Reading things and and working out to be Usain Bolt are very different, but a commitment to excellence and a commitment to looking at something from all sides,
Mm-hmm.
I think is crucial to what I do and that's what I try and that's what I aspire to. That's what I try and do.
So when you finished school, you talked about. Let's go there now. So
Mhm.
you talked about becoming a freelancer, and what was your engagement? What were your engagement expectations? And I say that from the standpoint of like, did you want to go and interview? What did you want to write about? Did you know that it was going to be print, or were you interested in other mediums?
I started out by wanting to work in magazines, but I also really love newspapers. And, so working for newspapers was really my aspiration. And I did that. I worked briefly. I managed to get a short-term job at the Star. I was offered a job there and moved on to the Globe. And then I have had sort of a long path at the Globe of doing one thing and another as an editor before I moved into my current role. I think, writing is definitely, journalism particularly, and long form journalism I've always loved it. Right? It's always driven me. And, for my particular kind of subject matter, there was this moment at the end of the 90s into the early 2000s after essentially the opening of the Guggenheim Bilbao in 1997, when architecture was all over pop culture, right? There was a moment there for 5, maybe 10 years until the great financial crisis when suddenly architecture was a subject that people were talking about again. It was that contemporary architecture had a kind of cultural relevance that it had not had in the preceding 30 years. And I think that's part of what opened my eyes to this subject matter. And I remember reading people, reading critics engaging with this stuff, locally and internationally. I remember very clearly reading, going back and reading the review of Bilbao that Herbert Mouchamp had written for the New York Times. And Herbert Mouchamp, compares the building to a dancer, right? It's this very flowery, rhetorical, really enthusiastic, and I can't find the right sort of adjective, but a kind of criticism in which, a certain, subjective presence is very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking that, having read a lot of literary criticism or reading about music, to read about a building and have someone describe it in that way, right? With that kind of fire and all this sort of narrative flair, let's say, and all of this linguistic play, you could do that too, right? I mean, I guess it was putting together the idea that, one could do some of the things that make literature beautiful and that make writing about literature, interesting, and apply that to the stuff around us. That to me seemed like a really powerful, was a powerful sort of entry point.
And so no one led you to this other than your own curiosity.
Pretty much it is. I make small talk with people and they ask, how did you wind up as an architecture critic? That's odd. And there is no really, it's a very niche profession, but this was a very specific thing that I found myself wanting to do. And I did kind of find my way there. It took me a while of, stumbling around to find my thing. And I found it, and I've been fortunate enough to actually make a living doing it.
Yeah. So before we talk about the next stage of Alex's development in his early 20s, I want to highlight something that literally shapes the buildings and architecture we're discussing. When it comes to European windows, the Doors is a company you need to know about. They specify products in all ranges from vinyl and fiberglass to their mainstay, which they do so well. Low profile aluminum windows in custom colors or standard colors. And whether you need curtain walls or curved glass, they can do curved glass. Yes, I have seen it and it is fantastic. We're talking about also 20-foot spans high or 20-foot spans wide, maneuvering it all with a spider crane that they have in-house. No rentals, only control. What really sets them apart is that absolutely everything is done in-house. All the pricing, all the quotes, all the measurements, including the installation and service. This year, they're celebrating their 20th anniversary, owned and operated by Marta and Martin. They work with incredible companies here in Toronto and abroad, and they are deeply appreciated and valued by every architecture and design practice I know they've worked with, including Eisen Architecture, Drew Mandel Architects, SMPL Design Studio, and more. They have a reputation for delivering on time and on budget. The beauty of working with the Doors is that you get a dedicated team. You are never handed off, which means there's accountability at every single stage. Their product performs at the absolute highest level. So whether you have strict passive house requirements, and that's whether you want to get certified or not, or you simply want high-grade double pane or triple pane glass, they have what you need. Fantastic thermal breaks and R values. You couldn't ask for more. And they aren't just servicing Toronto, they're servicing the GTA, Canada, and the US, as well as the islands and the Caribbean and the Bahamas. If you want to learn more, head over to the liner notes to connect with them, or email me and I'll set up an introduction to their fantastic team, which includes Martin, Marta, Mario, who has been with them for 20 years, and Radek, who leads their business development and is incredibly high energy. So speaking of that, let's get back to Alex to hear more about him and his experiences in life. So let's talk about, can we talk about the stage of development from completing university to ultimately landing in this role?
Mm-hmm.
You touched on it. What were you doing before the Star?
For
how long did that last?
So I spent a couple of years in grad school in Toronto and then in New York, and realized that I didn't really want to be an English professor. My wife and I were together at this point, so we came back to Toronto and I started to freelance. And it was a bit of a grind initially. I had worked for I Weekly, the alternative weekly, which existed at that point.
Yeah,
I had some connections, and I started to try to make a living as a freelance journalist.
What was that like?
I mean, it's tough now. It was slightly less tough then, but it's a competitive business and a lot of things work on connections and networks, right? Yeah. As is the case in any business. I didn't go to journalism school, so I didn't have the kind of network that a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And I sort of had to prove myself as a writer, cold calling and pitching to be able to start writing things, initially book reviews, which were kind of an easy way in to certain publications.
Yeah. And you just said something, by the way, that I think most people nowadays do not do. They might even know the term.
Yeah.
Cold calling.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this and you're debating what you should do for yourself, try picking up a phone and making some cold calls. Cold calls are calls when you don't know the other person on the other side.
Yeah.
You're trying to just get them. So most people will email, they'll text, but they won't do this.
Yeah.
If you're listening, go do that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a powerful tool, and I didn't love it. I didn't love selling myself. Selling myself is not something that comes especially naturally to me, but, I had enough hustle to make it work and, got a few gigs and then some more gigs, and found some ways into sort of the softer corners of the industry, the places where there was more room for freelancers, and where freelancers were, and where I was able to write about some of the subjects that interested me, including the real estate sections of the newspapers, right? Which were also very large then, and which did journalism as they do now, not just about houses, but also about planning and occasionally about public buildings and public spaces. And so I did a little bit of that and found my way just through reporting and talking to people to get a better understanding of some of these issues that I was writing about. What is an official plan? Why is everybody yelling about the Ontario Municipal Board? Why are all these new towers getting built, and why are they only getting built in a few places? And why are people so mad about this?
And Google and AI were not as powerful. I mean, AI didn't exist.
It did not.
And Google was not very powerful back then. So there was a reference library and other areas where you could be able to go and source your knowledge on the subject.
I mean, I read a lot of journalism and I read some books, right? And I also talked to people a lot. And because I was working here locally, and almost all of the writing I was doing was initially local. There were books on Toronto, and I got to know some people. I connected a little bit later with the people who run Spacing Magazine and that whole circle of journalists and activists. Several of whom are my friends now. But I was a little bit of a lone wolf, and I just sort of found my way to convince myself to get out of the house and push hard enough until I got enough of a record as a writer that one of my editors at the Globe and Mail recommended me for a job, which I applied for and which I got. Thank you, Carol Toller. And
I'll say it too. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, I'm still grateful. I hope she's doing great. I haven't seen her in a few years. And so from there, I was in the Globe and, started a sort of tumultuous period just as the industry was going through this very dramatic upheaval.
And what was the role?
I was a copy editor. Okay. And, what that means is essentially you do kind of structural edits on a piece.
Yep.
So a piece that already exists, does it flow properly? Are there logical gaps? Are there spelling and grammar problems? Are there questions that need to be answered that have been, that are things that are left unclear in the copy? And when all that's done, the thing needs a headline. It needs a secondary headline. It needs the photo needs a caption underneath it. So all of that work, which was done, there were more resources for that kind of thing then. Now this is all done, much more quickly and hastily than it was in those days. But
how many, what's the right term here? How many pieces were you reviewing as a copy editor on a given day?
Several. I want to say like maybe 4 or 5, something like that. So it was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
But a reasonable workflow, especially by today's standards. I also was lucky enough to be part of a team that was working on what was then a weekly section at the Globe that was covering Toronto news.
Okay.
So it was Toronto, hard news and features. So sort of a real range of, it was great. It was a real range of journalism, almost like a little bit of a magazine that had short pieces and long ones, stories about crime, stories about politics, restaurant reviews, all in one sort of package, which I was interested in and was a really good sort of training ground for me to try learning about and working on different journalistic forms. So, I had a little bit of skill by then, and, doing that work and working with some experienced writers, you learn, right? I mean, being an editor is a very good training for being a writer. And there are many such cases.
You get to see so much content of so many different writers. Mm-hmm. Understanding how they're putting their compositions together.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you know what to do, ideally, you know what to do with your own copy, although it's not usually quite that simple.
And so how long were you in that role?
One role and another. I was an editor of one kind or another for 9 years. Okay. I think we're almost 10 years. There's a lot of jumping around. The Globe was doing a bunch of restructuring because the industry was, going through huge upheavals at the time. A lot of older folks who had been around when the industry was, newspapers used to be extremely profitable, and newspapers up until about 2000 or 2005 were still a fairly sleepy business. And then they weren't all of a sudden. The turn to online and the business implications of that, were pretty dramatic. And so a lot of things changed. So I sort of came of age thinking I was going to be, moving into this industry that was like, quiet and slow moving, and where there was a lot of time to think if you were in the right chair in the right corner. And that, was not really how things played out. Not that I have complaints, the Globe treated me well. There were a bunch of changes. I did a bunch of different things within the newsroom. But I wound up as an editor writing off the side of my desk and was able to eventually get the job that I have to actually do this writing full time and to focus my energy on, the thing that I was really my passion, that I think is my strength.
Okay. I like that term, writing off the side of my desk. It's subtle. It's good. I like that.
My bosses didn't always love it, but there was a compromise.
I mean, it's sort of like, to put it into terms of those of you that are in the design industry, it's like, you're doing your main job, and then, some things might happen after hours.
Many such cases.
So tell me what it was like when you pitched the concept of going and writing on architecture. How did you develop a business case for this?
Well, the Globe already had one. The Globe already had someone doing what I was doing. She was, her name was Lisa Rochon. She had that position for about 10 years, but she was a freelancer. And I think it was really a matter of me sort of making the case and certain editors seeing that, I would be strong in that role. And that as someone who is kind of already working inside the organization, that it would be kind of a natural fit for me to do that. And so I had a few pieces in which I got to kind of, essentially audition. If you were going to do this, what would it look like? And my bosses at the time were pleased with that. And through, a complicated set of internal moves, I worked to, was doing that job part-time and then eventually full-time. And it is a very particular niche that I've landed in. But, I think I was able to, I think I was able to convince people in the newsroom that, this idea of having an architecture critic, what is that anyway? Could be something that had news value, that would, provide a kind of value to our readers that, they couldn't really find anywhere else. And I think that continues to be the case. Mm-hmm. Our readers, my readers, many of them are in the industry, particularly in architecture. I think many people who are in the architecture and in the related fields, read what I do. I mean, I hope that they do. But I think for other people as well, having a kind of an educated guide who can explain what's going on in this corner, like what all this, weird stuff is all about, what all these people are throwing around the jargon are really talking about. And also like what some of the sort of structural forces are, why the cities that we're living in, why they look the way they do,
right? Why
they're devolving in the way that they do. I find that incredibly interesting. And I hope, and I think that, I'm able to communicate that, and, readers will come with me perhaps into some like slightly obscure corners too, because, hopefully they have, are coming to trust me and my interests and my enthusiasms. And, I can convince them that, these slightly, obscure things are actually worth their time.
Yeah. To be honest, what I find interesting about all of this is, and I asked the question at the beginning about, where were you born and where did you grow up? And having been born and growing up in Toronto, which is, it's a big cultural hub in North America.
Yes.
You understand the city in a way that some others that weren't from here don't, right? And when you extend that across Canada, and for those listening that are outside of Canada, I mean, it's a relatively large country.
There's
a lot of mass.
And a lot of empty space between the cities.
Yeah. And Ontario itself is huge. There's a whole region to Ontario that a lot of people don't know about. But as I say all of this, I say it because you come at it with a different form of understanding than some others may or may not. And so when you look at the issues that matter and how a city evolves, and the fact that, you could have a massive organization moving offices and opening offices here in Toronto. Well, the architecture is going to allow for that or not allow for that. Yeah. If there's development happening, then great. And if there isn't, well, they might have a tough time finding space.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you're focusing on and what you do actually is the foundational work of what could come later in the paper in a couple months.
I think that's an interesting way to put it. And I have, I read a lot about city planning, right, over the last 5 or 7 years. And I do think that it is, what you've said is true. I mean, the built environment, which is to say all the buildings and, spaces that we make, are both kind of the products of economic conditions, and they also create them, right?
Yes.
I mean, and I fundamentally believe that, cities are powerful, powerful things. I love cities. I love this city, but I also love cities in general because
Yes.
cities are about, human ingenuity and about
Yeah.
the stuff that people do when they come together.
Yeah.
And that, is what drives me. And that means public space, but it also means commerce. It means people figuring out how to work together as well as how to be together. And so planning is, I think, really interesting because planning in the related field of urban design, which I also teach now, are deeply important, but they're not really well scrutinized, right? You're not necessarily, if you're I don't think the prime minister spends a lot of time thinking about city planning. I don't think the premier of Ontario, who is, in charge of city planning, spends a lot of time thinking about city planning, certainly in a systematic or in a rigorous way. And so, these very big public policy decisions and very big economic decisions that shape our lives are happening without the same kind of discourse and the same kind of push and pull that we apply to other things, like healthcare and education, which are of course important, which are more important, but there's a lot of stuff that, doesn't get looked at that is, fundamental.
So could you give an example of that?
Yeah. I mean, housing politics. I've written a lot about housing politics, and I've been sort of a strong advocate for planning reform, zoning reform to allow for more people to live in cities, particularly the most prosperous big cities in this country, particularly Toronto, where a lot of people want to be or need to be. And I don't think it's well understood that it's hard to move here. On the one hand, it's hard to move to Toronto or hard to move to Vancouver. It's expensive. Everyone understands that. But not everybody understands that it's not that easy to build new housing here for all of the people who want to live here, because you can't build apartment buildings in very many places. Even after some changes of the last few years, which have been positive, government stands in the way of certain kinds of change in our cities. A lot of the planning profession quite tightly sort of shapes and regulates what we do as a city. And that's true in Toronto and it's true in other places. And that has consequences. There is a link. It's complicated, but there is a link between the fact that you can't build apartment buildings on essentially 95% of the city of Toronto and the fact that it's expensive to live here. Those things are connected. And there are people who will argue strenuously that that is, an oversimplification, or even that isn't really true. But while it is complicated, it is absolutely true, right? And I think, I find it strange that we are willing to make these decisions about, where people are allowed to live, right? And where we want our homes and our jobs to be and how they're going to be connected, all without kind of acknowledging the fact that we, as I say, are not really thinking deeply about that as people, right? I mean, planning is treated as this sort of complex technical subject that's done by experts. Mm-hmm. But, the planning profession, the public sector planning profession has landed in very particular places and is generally hostile to change, is generally hostile to, businesses and homes being mixed up with each other, is hostile to big buildings and small buildings being mixed up with each other. And I think those are problems. I think variety and diversity in a physical sense, and we can see this from looking at cities that already exist, diversity and variety are good. They allow for more different kinds of stuff to happen. They allow for people to have choices about where they live and how they live and where they work and where they play and where they spend time in public. Mm-hmm. And
so on that topic, what do you feel are some of the cities that exist that do this really well that could be replicated?
It's tricky because, this planning stuff is very sort of pretty specific to like the culture and the regulations of different countries. But
assume that was gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a tricky recipe. I mean, I would say, I went to Tokyo for the first time a couple of years ago. Yeah. And there are a lot of people in, my world of urbanism who will tell you that Tokyo is an incredible example. And in many ways, I agree. I mean, Tokyo is a very, very large city that has more than one center and that has a tremendous public transit network that links essentially the entire region together. And it's a city where everything is mixed up, like to a spectacular degree. The streets are incredibly narrow. buildings are very close together.
Yeah.
There are large buildings next to small buildings, and there are shops and even industry on, little side streets in, marginal neighborhoods where you wouldn't expect them to be. You can be walking down, a side street and next to a transit station that's, 10 kilometers away from the center, and you will find, a fantastic restaurant in the middle of the block. And you will find the famous, Japanese convenience stores that sell, will sell you an excellent fresh lunch for, $2.50. And that all happens because of the economic productivity that comes with, and the creativity that comes with having so many people all together, right? You have 20 million people living in close proximity, all with their own hustles, all with their own ideas, and amazing things happen. And if you learn to live, close together with other folks, then you get to benefit from all of that, diversity, and the result is really interesting. Then the tricky part becomes, fine, Tokyo, which has, by North American standards, basically no zoning regulations, like very, very, very loose regulations. You can do, not quite, but you can do almost anything, almost anywhere, to oversimplify a little bit. Now, how do we imitate that here? Right? I mean, and this is where the qualitative side comes in, I think, because, the first question is about cars, right? In North American cities, even Toronto, there are a lot of cars, and people are very reluctant to exclude cars, even from a particular street or particular block. Whereas, that's not the case in Tokyo. And there's a whole different set of infrastructure. I mean, they have fire trucks that are very small, that can fit down small streets, right? And there's a kind of set of social expectations that come together. When you live on a block with 1,000 people, you're not going to be playing your music that loud. You're not going to have a motorcycle and rev the engine. You don't have a leaf blower, right? I mean, there's a certain kind of social conformity is not exactly the right word, but people social expectations. And I mean, and Japan is an extremely homogeneous and extremely conformist society, right? And we're not in the same way. And so it's tricky to say that there's sort of a magic bullet, or that there's sort of one sort of magic example that you can follow. Copenhagen in Denmark is another one that, urbanists love and that I love too. And you could say a lot of the same things about that. A very homogeneous, relatively closed society, with strong sort of social bonds and strong sort of shared expectations. And we don't always have those to the same degree here. So cities, like, you can't just talk about buildings and street widths, because you end up talking about, what people do in the streets, and what kind of manners people have, and, how far they're willing to go to, reach their car if it's parked somewhere,
While we're touching on how cities manage their infrastructure and public spaces, it makes me think about our park system here in Toronto, and by extension, our public pools. One of the big issues that happened here in Toronto last summer was a wave of pool closures on the absolute hottest days of the year, which really highlighted the value of having access to a reliable, beautifully constructed pool. And that leads me to an incredible business owner named Yuri, who owns Aquanta Pools, supplying revolutionary systems here in the GTA called Biodesign from Italy. Yuri was recently telling me about a substantial project he is building outside of the city at a dog sanctuary. They are creating an entire pool network, almost like a lazy river, just for dogs. When you think about boarding a dog in the heat of summer, they are usually just outside sweating nonstop. But with this specialized biodesign system, the dogs can move safely through all these different sections of water to stay cool. What makes biodesign pools so unique is that they aren't your traditional concrete box. They use a patented structural coating made from natural stone and high-performance resins. Because of this resin, you don't have to worry about allergies, and the algae that typically binds to traditional pool surfaces simply cannot adhere to it. Now, take this concept beyond a dog sanctuary and imagine this in your own backyard, at a hotel, or in a community center. The accessibility is a game changer. Biodesign allows for a natural beach-like entry, meaning you can just walk right into the water down a gentle slope. The surface is entirely tactile and non-slip, transforming the space into a true oasis. You can even install a water jet system to swim in place, and it works seamlessly with all types of filtration systems. Yuri has been doing this for 20 years, and one of the best parts about working with him is that he has complete control over his construction environment. He actually builds a temporary structure over the site so that his team experiences absolutely zero weather delays. The beauty of that is that your project hits its schedule and hits its budget. If you want to learn more, head over to the liner notes, or you can email me and I will introduce you to Yuri. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, at issuedforconstruction.ca. All right, let's look at another city making major infrastructure moves.
And I guess,
downtown London, London, right? I've not been, but what I understand is that you can't drive a car at any time you want into downtown London.
You can. It's just expensive.
Yeah.
Right. There's a congestion charge in the center now, which is, if you're rich, is not really going to trouble you that much, but it's enough to hurt.
Yes.
Right. And so that was already a city that has, had the world's first or second, I can never remember, metro system. Right. I mean, London's had mass transit, in a meaningful way for 150 years.
Yeah.
But there were still people driving, and Paris is an excellent example as well. Paris, which had a lot of cars in its center 20 years ago and now does not, because of these kinds of policies, congestion charges. So if you're going to drive your car, it's a little trickier, a little more expensive. Public transit gets better. And the streets are clear. In London, buses move more easily because there are fewer cars on the road. Right. And this is, we can't necessarily replicate that exactly in North America or in Toronto, but there are lessons. I think there are lessons, which is that at a certain point in some places, you have to have public space that doesn't have cars in it.
Right. Yep.
You have to have streets that don't have as many cars in them. It can't be easy to drive a car absolutely everywhere at any time and park it. Because if you have a place like that, where you have that kind of ease of access with a private car, that's not a good place. That's Dallas. Right. And nobody wants to go walk around downtown Dallas because it sucks. Right.
Sorry, Dallas.
So, sorry to, my friend and colleague.
Fault.
There are a lot of North American cities, including in this country, where, the center, the place where people would come together, where, the cultural institutions are, where the sports team plays, is not really a place you want to spend time. And what makes a city attractive, what makes a city, pleasant to spend time in, is public space. It's being, outside with other people. That's always been the case, and it's still the case now. And there is a tension. Cars are not the only problem, but just the omnipresence of cars and the expectation that cars should be on every street, everywhere, all the time, and be able to move quickly. We got to give that up a little bit. And if we can, I want to talk about the trade-offs, because if you start to do that in a city, you get beautiful things as well. Paris is great for this. The longtime mayor of Paris, who's just left office, Anne Hidalgo, managed to eliminate tens of thousands of parking spaces in Paris, which is a very dense city without a lot of green space, and has replaced those with a lot of green, and has limited car access in a lot of places in the city, and has increased the presence of bike lanes all over the place, not just in the center, but across all of Paris. And Paris is unique, but it also, it's a city where you used to be able to drive everywhere 20 years ago, and now you can't so easily anymore. And it's nicer. I was there a couple of times in the last few years, and this story has been very widely told, but it is beautiful to hang out on a street or on a passageway next to a river where there are hundreds or thousands of people spending time together, chatting, socializing, buying a drink, going to a restaurant, going shopping, in an environment where you're surrounded by, people and culture and options of things to do, but where the city is also relatively quiet and relatively comfortable to walk through.
Right.
And where there's more green.
Yeah, you don't hear people honking their horns.
And you don't hear people honking their horns.
Right.
This, right? Nobody wants to walk through a parking lot, right? Nobody likes to, stand next to a busy street. And I guess, we've gone down a little tangent here with cars, but I think, when you look at what's in front of us here, that's one sort of easy fix. It's just not getting rid of them and not sort of digging into this culture war about, cars being bad. But there are some places where people need to be together and do stuff and not be in their cars.
Yeah.
And we need a little more of that.
What's interesting. So when I had Bradford on before, and we, his background was in urban planning.
Yes.
One of the interesting things that he had talked about was the idea of, reinstating the 4 lanes of downtown Toronto so that Adelaide and Richmond could actually work as major arteries of getting in and out of the city.
Yeah.
And you free up other stuff and you use some AI.
Yeah.
And I was like, it makes a lot of sense. But I also know that people love bike lanes. And I say this because like I drive my car to get to where I need to go most of the time.
Yeah.
In a city that is as populated and as dense as what we are,
Yeah.
and also sprawled at the same time.
Yes.
Do you think that it could work? Because I say that about here, like we've tried it to an extent. There's been a lot of people that get very angry about it.
Yes.
So what do you think is missing from it?
I mean, I think, Brad is a trans city planner, and I think Brad, if he's being honest, understands, this issue in pretty much the same way I do. I think he can't run on that now because, being the right-wing candidate for mayor means you have to say some different things. But it was John Tory who was proposing a congestion charge for downtown Toronto, right? When he was mayor. I mean, this is even an issue that has gone a little bit beyond, at least at some points, has gone beyond sort of the standard sort of obvious political boundaries. You can't, I think you need to think about this as a system and also to think about it as a region. And while you raise a very good point that there are a lot of places, essentially, there are a lot of places in the GTHA where you cannot get on a bike, right? And where you are not going to get on a bike.
Yeah. Well, I also think about winter.
Yeah.
And like, the seasonality of Toronto is a challenge.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm, a middle-aged guy who is not exactly in, heroic physical condition, and I'm riding a
What a way to describe it.
I mean, I'm like a pretty average middle-aged guy. I am not, a totally committed, cycle warrior. And I rode a bike 10 months out of 12 last year. Not every day.
Yeah.
But I do. And I track this because I use the city bike share to get around around the central city, in a 5 or 8 kilometer radius. And like, I used those bikes in January and in February when it wasn't snowy and icy. You can do that. I mean, not everybody's going to do that, and they're not going to do it all the time.
Yeah.
But, the Gardner Expressway is also empty, 12 hours a day. I mean, when everybody's in bed, there's nobody on the highway either. When the office workers are mostly on vacation, the roads aren't as crowded as they are at other times of year.
Right.
Nothing is going to be busy all the time. Our transportation networks are always dynamic. And I think you need to be, for me, that's about numbers. There was a long debate about the Gardner Expressway, the rebuild of one portion of the Gardner Expressway. This is 10 years ago now. And what I learned from that was that about 5% of the people who commute into downtown Toronto in rush hour, 5% of them were driving cars on the Gardner East. So 95% of people coming into downtown Toronto, and this is before the pandemic when when everybody was in the office, 95% of them were coming other ways. And so, people tend to treat these questions about transportation as being all or nothing. We have cars, we don't have cars, but that's not how this stuff works, right? Yeah. That's not how cities work. Yep. If you were to, there was this big debate, and I'm not sure where Bradford is on this now, but there was this big debate 10 years ago about whether to rebuild that expressway more or less as it is, which is what we're doing, or to bring it down to the ground and have almost the same number of lanes, but have some traffic lights in the way. So you weren't getting rid of the ability to drive. You're just making it a little less convenient. Yep. And people painted that as like the apocalypse, that 5% of commuters into downtown Toronto would have an incremental slowdown on their way into the city. This happens now with the expressways. We see driving on a highway over a long distance as this kind of like holy thing. And as if that's everybody and that's the whole economy and it's the whole city. And it's just not. I mean, the number of people who take the Dufferin bus every day is higher than the number of people who drive on the east part of the Gardner Expressway. How many times have you heard a politician complain about the state of the Dufferin bus? You haven't, right? Because, some people's experiences seem to matter more than others.
Right.
So you got to be a little hard-headed about it, that yes, some people are going to be inconvenienced as this city of Toronto grows to a different scale, to a different order of magnitude than it has been in the past. Right. And you're still going to drive. And I have a car and I use it, not all the time, but I use it regularly. There are a lot of places where you can drive, and there are some places where it's harder. And there are going to be more places in the busiest, most visited, most important parts of the city where it's going to be a little harder to drive your car and a little more expensive to drive your car. And in exchange, those places are going to be nicer. They're going to be nicer to spend time in. People are going to spend more money in them. Mm-hmm. People are going to enjoy being in the city more and want to come back here and want to invest here. I think there's a lot of evidence for that general point of view. That's been Paris, that's been London, that's been New York City. And so rather than doing this culture war, black and white framing of these issues. I think we need to be just realistic and incremental. I'm going to change a few things around the edges in a certain direction, and the sky is not going to fall.
So what about the idea of a sweeping reform of the way that RFPs work in the city to be able to see some of those changes?
What kind of RFPs are we talking?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask me back.
Are you talking about transportation or moving on to other subjects?
No, I would say from RFPs in who gets to design and create public space.
Yeah.
RFPs and who's winning public institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of change to be made there. I mean, I firmly believe that, Toronto is pretty good at a lot of this stuff. We have some recent wins in creating parks, such as the ones that Waterfront Toronto has done.
Yeah.
I think of Sugar Beach and the Cortan Common and of Love Park, all created by Waterfront Toronto, two of them designed by Claude Cormier and his office, the landscape architect. We make some really good public spaces, but we need to make better ones. And I think people in Toronto and people in Canada generally sort of trust public institutions for the most part, and people want to be in public space. We don't have the kind of like hostility towards, public things that a lot of Americans do. But, our public spaces are used, but they could be better. And
yes.
This is why, this is a topic I have written a fair bit about, that how we design a new park, how we design a rebuild of a park, how we think about what should go into a park. Should there be restaurants and cafes in more of our parks? Should our parks have different qualities?
Hold on. You just jumped over that. 100% my answer to that last
right?
one.
Yeah.
Like the idea of being able to go to a park,
yes,
and a large scale park,
yes,
and to have the option to sit down and have some food and a coffee,
yeah,
or a tea, whatever, and to sit and have some shade and actually have a nice place to sit would be really nice.
You just said that to me is the recipe, or a really good recipe for a lot of public space. There's somewhere to eat and drink, also a washroom.
Yeah.
There's places to sit. There are places to sit in the shade, because a lot of the time when we're outside, it is summertime and it is hot. And those things do not exist in a lot of our public space. And the reasons for that are a whole other weird kettle of fish. But I've had this conversation with a number of people. My kids are now teenagers. I've spent 15 years hanging out in parks,
yeah.
And had a lot of conversations with people who aren't interested in landscape architecture or in city planning, who say, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we could get a coffee? Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could buy the kids a snack without having to walk around the corner to Tim Hortons to do it? Yeah. I mean, I think these are
an independent company.
Yeah.
Not a chain.
A good cafe, God forbid, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and some chairs and tables to sit at. I mean,
that didn't cost $8, by the way.
That didn't cost $8. I mean, this is all doable. And these are not, that is not earth-shatteringly complex or earth-shatteringly expensive to let that kind of thing happen.
Yeah.
So, what is public space for? And if a park is not just, a big field with a baseball diamond or a soccer field and a playground, but it can be other things. And our parks often are other things. How do we make this work so people can have a good time there and spend time with each other in public? And I think there are a bunch of models for how to do that exist, in any random city in Europe or any random city in South America, or, in most random cities in East Asia, for that matter. We just have a certain kind of, we don't ask enough in some ways of our public spaces, and we spend a fair amount of money on them, but we don't necessarily think about, a park is not necessarily a place for recreation. Always. It's not always a place for sports. It's not always a place to be in nature. Often, even most of the time, I would argue, parks in cities are places to be around other people.
Yeah.
And that sounds simple, but if you get that in mind, then all of a sudden, then yes, seating and, umbrellas, shade, food, water, washrooms. I mean, sounds basic.
As you say all this, it's funny. So I years ago worked with a guy whose name is Ben Bankus, and he is a relatively what adjective would I use to describe Ben's comedy? Do you know?
No, I don't.
I don't. Okay, so I would say that Ben does a lot of political comedy, accents, and all different kinds of stuff. Very controversial. Largely controversial. Originally from Toronto, now living in Austin, Texas. And what I bring Ben up one is because he's become one of Canada's most successful comedians, but two, a lot of what he did to practice his comedy was like stand up comedy in the park.
Mhm.
I think it was in Riverdale, and potentially Ben,
It's
if
funny.
you're ever listening to this, but who knows? But I don't know if he did it at Christie Pitts too. But I know that it was I know he did some stuff at Riverdale, and what it was like to stand literally with a microphone and a speaker
Yeah.
while people have their blankets out
Yeah.
on a hill.
Yeah.
No amphitheater, nothing.
Yeah.
Just him and a mic.
Love that.
Right? But how nice would it be if there was that opportunity where you could go rent an amphitheater?
Mhm. Totally. Or even just sort of take the space. I mean, I live near Christie Pitts, and I've raised 2 kids near there, and I don't need to be in Christie Pitts. I have a house, with a tiny backyards, and there's a bunch of other parks around there. I'm not in the position that a lot of people are, which is that, being outside and, having, means you have to be in the park, but I like to be. And I spend a lot of time there, and I think about why people like it. And the reason people like to be there in that park, which is a little bit janky, if we're being honest, is mostly what you've just described, right? I mean, there are buskers, and there's an event, there's a festival happening every other weekend in the summer.
Yeah.
But, people gather there even though there's nowhere to sit, and they light on their blankets on the soccer field because there's nowhere to sit, and they buy food from the in Banjara, the Indian restaurant up the hill, or from Tim Hortons because there's no cafe, because they want to be in a place where things are happening.
Yes.
They want to be around other people.
Yeah, and they want to people watch. Yeah. All of that.
Who doesn't like to people watch, right? And this to me is, that's not all of what a city is for, but that's one of the pleasures of being in a city,
Totally.
There are people around, stuff happens. Why can't we lean into that and, appreciate it and strengthen it?
Well, I had an incredible experience when I was in Austin. I went and I was touring around Austin with Murray Legg, and he took us through some incredible installations in parks that were designed.
Yeah.
And one of them, I can't remember the name of the park, but one of them was this huge structure. Underneath it, you could sit, I think, at benches, but the structure itself raised, it was all massive steel.
Yeah.
And in the center was like a big hammock.
Mm-hmm.
And you could lie on it. Do you know, have you been there? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I haven't been there, but I know the thing. Yeah.
I don't know who designed it. Anyhow.
Yeah.
But you lie down, and now you're doing it during the day. It's hot, but I could envision going there at 9:30 at night and looking up and seeing the stars.
Yep.
And I'm in a public space that's giving me this opportunity to be off the ground and enjoy the view into the cosmos.
Love that.
Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't. I can't think of anywhere in Toronto where I'd be able to get that.
There's not. There's not a lot of. After 9 o'clock, there's nothing you can't even really be in the parks. They don't even have the lights on. They don't want you to be in the parks.
That's there. You're touching on another major element. Is do you feel safe in a park at night?
Yeah. I do, but I'm also, like a 6 foot tall man, and I understand that not everybody does, right? And I think that's an issue. And there is a weird way in which all of this stuff we've been talking about the last few minutes comes together, which is, having activity in public space doesn't make it less safe. It makes it safer and more interesting because you have people around, right? People have heard, the phrase from Jane Jacobs, eyes on the street, right? That she applied to, the Greenwich Village neighborhood when she lived there, in the late 50s, early 60s. Basically there are always people around. And when you talk about people who are experts in placemaking or people who understand, crime prevention through environmental design, in general, it's a pretty strong common thread that if you have people around, it's better. If you have a steady, reliable presence of people, then other people will want to be there because, it's a place that has a sense of security and safety about it.
Yes.
Right? Which again seems totally obvious, but I know that escapes some of us in Toronto. The old City Hall building, which, the city has kind of sort of opened up for a few hours, on every Friday last summer.
The vacant building?
The vacant building, which things should be happening in right now. When they opened it up, the building was crawling with security guards. There must have been 20 security guards, wandering around this building, when what they really needed and what we need in our parks is, somebody running her cafe, right? and maybe some volunteer docents and, volunteer staffers or maintenance staff who are there, a park manager whose job it is to take care of, to keep an eye on everything. You don't necessarily need police or rent-a-cops to create a sense of security. You need to bring people into a place and make them comfortable and give them something to do and have some kind of staff around who don't have to be security, but, if something goes wrong, can call the police. You know what I mean? There's this sense where we want our public spaces to be free of commerce. And, our only option for, activating them is, a one-time event or a festival, which, by the way, has to be, surveilled by 10 off-duty cops, who have, charge whatever they charge.
Yeah.
Which makes these things, hard and in some ways unfriendly. Like
it's funny, that as you describe all of this, as logical as what you're saying is, it's not something that I personally really have taken note of as what makes me enjoy the spaces that I enjoy in the public realm. I never really thought about you feel safe because you just have other people there.
Yeah.
And it's not a police officer. It's interesting you say it. And if you're listening, think about that for a sec. It's worth giving that thought because it really does change the way you perceive it. Being surrounded by other people changes things.
Yeah.
It just does.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And to some degree, look, all of this stuff can be complicated, right? Our cities are diverse and our cities have problems now. The opioid epidemic is a thing, and that's not the city's fault, by the way. And it's not the city that is going to be able to help people who are struggling with opioids. But, there are issues. But, there are ways in which thinking about a place, making a place do more than one thing, and making a place come to life through a variety of activity, which can be a mix of public things and some commerce, these can reinforce each other.
Yeah.
If done the right way, they reinforce each other. More of a private presence done the right way. Having a limited private presence in public space doesn't ruin it. If it did, back to Paris, or back to London, nobody in those cities believes that having a kiosk or a cafe in the middle of a park means that it's polluted and the park doesn't work anymore. Of course there's a kiosk. Of course there's a cafe because, why would you have a city park without somewhere where you can buy coffee? It's like that's civilization, right? And so I think, Toronto is big enough now that it certainly in its most populated areas, we can borrow that model and just be more intentional about how our public spaces are operated, how they're maintained, what happens in them. And the more we do that, I think, it is very possible with not that much money to make people's lives a lot better by doing that stuff. And I firmly believe that most people would enjoy that. I think, if you don't like cities, don't live in a city. And there's some people and there's some people who don't. Right? Some people really do not like cities and they don't want to be in a park surrounded by strangers. But I don't think that's most people. In any, the suburban towns I grew up in, there's always, the Canada Day Festival and everybody's there in the park for the fireworks. And, there's a band in the band shell. That is what people enjoy, right? It's the farmer's market, on Saturday morning that people enjoy. People enjoy being around other people.
The farmers markets for sure. Look at the brickworks during the summertime.
It's amazing.
Right? And all of the different types of events that they start hosting there and how it brings the community together. It's great. Last year we took our kids to a movie night there. And, the kids have seen the movie 10 times before, but because you're now surrounded, it goes back to your point. Yeah. Because you're surrounded by people.
It's fun.
You're willing to spend a little bit more money on the concessions.
Yeah.
Because you're with other people. And it's an environment that is an experience that's completely different.
And that's a great example. The Brickworks, I just toured an out of 10 guest around there recently. I have some small issues with how it's run, but basically, that's a city site that has a bunch of buildings on it that are now being run by a not-for-profit that provides and brings certain kinds of programming, including educational programming.
Yeah, my kids go to a camp there.
My kids have done camp there too. Yeah. They did the winter camp and they still talk about it years later, it's wonderful. And so they're in touch with from being there and just us hanging out and playing in the mud, and climbing the hills, and then me buying an overpriced coffee and an overpriced lunch from the cafe, which is there.
It's so crazy how much that coffee costs.
Bananas. It's bananas. It's Rosedale, it's priced for Rosedale. And I don't love it, but you know what? I will pay that, the $14 for that
Because you're
sandwich.
going to go walk around with your kids.
And that place is an amazing place. It has vibe. It has variety. It has things going on.
Yeah.
Is it necessary that, the only cafe and restaurant in this amazing place is that expensive? No, it is not necessary.
I mean, do you need to have an outdoor patio store that has like $400 chairs?
You do not. But, I think about this in terms of, how this works in other rich cities around the world.
Yeah.
I was in Tokyo. I mentioned I was in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And I visited this very large complex that is, shopping mall, office, hotel, all in one sort of large mall, sort of like, Hudson Yards. It was Amityville in New York or the Well in Toronto.
Yeah.
And, there's a bookstore as part of this complex. That's a very upscale art bookstore. And, you're standing there, there are art book monographs that are $400. And then there's a little cafe that off the bookstore that serves, single malt scotch and pour over coffee, where the pour over coffee is, the equivalent of $12. And literally next to this cafe is a kombini, one of these incredible convenience stores, like the Japanese version of 7-Eleven, where you can, and I did, buy a really good sandwich for $2.30. Right? You can buy the $500 book and you can buy the $4 lunch in the same place. It's possible, right? I mean,
you're speaking to two different buyers, and that's okay.
They can be there they can be there at the same time. Yeah. They can be there at different times. And I'm sure, I suspect the bookstore does well. And I suspect the bookstore does not suffer that, middle-class people or working class people, may pass through the bookstore, buying a card or an inexpensive book or, like the $3 sandwich. This idea that, happens in retail, right? In shopping malls, where everything's indoors and, all the expensive stuff is clustered in one corner and all the expensive stores are now in Yorkdale, in one corner of Yorkdale. That is one way to be. That to sort people out, economically and socially is one way to be, but it's not the only way. And the cities that people love to visit, that we go to visit as tourists, people go to London, they go to Paris, they go to New York. I mean, what is special about New York is that it's mixed up.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you don't go to New York to wander the streets of the Upper East Side and look at the $50 million townhouses. I mean, you might, but that's not really the point. You go to New York to go to Central Park, or to walk the High Line, or to visit these public institutions, which are funded in many cases with private wealth, but not entirely. And it's that, you wouldn't want to be in a place where things and people are not mixed up, because that is our segregation is not fun. Segregation is not just, and also doesn't make dynamic places, and it doesn't make beautiful places. And if we worry too much about sorting ourselves out, in neighborhoods or even on blocks or how we get around, I think you're giving up a lot.
It's funny, you say this. I moved into the area that I live in here in Leaside because I love to trail ride.
Mm-hmm.
And off of my street, there's over 100 kilometers of single track.
Nice.
And I spend a good portion of the nice weather in Toronto within that park system.
Yeah.
And what does not exist anywhere in the entire park system is a cafe.
Yeah.
To be able to stop in the middle of a ride.
Yeah.
And grab a quick little espresso and then go back out. Doesn't exist. You have to leave the park system to be able to go and experience that.
Yep.
Or you've got to go all the way, all the way south to Leslieville Beaches to get there, or you're popping out. It's such an I never really have stopped to give this thought.
It doesn't make sense though, right? I mean, there is an effort to
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. There's an effort to work on this now. There's a thing called the Loop Trail project that the city, together with Evergreen, who runs the Brickworks, is working on. But I mean, there's an extension of that. It's like, you ride and you want to be able to get some water, get a snack, use the washroom, right? But I mean, so does everybody else, regardless of what they're doing, right? I mean, the Brickworks, the Evergreen Brickworks that we're speaking about, for those who don't know Toronto, is, in the Don River Valley, this deep valley that's right next to Rosedale, the richest neighborhood in the country. and yet also very close to a neighborhood of a very dense neighborhood of apartment towers called St. Jamestown, which is the densest neighborhood in the country and is largely home to new immigrants, who are living in pretty close quarters. And those people can't easily get down into the valley to visit the Evergreen Brickworks from where they are, even though it's just a couple kilometers, because there's no shuttle bus. The trails are not well marked. You don't know how to get there, and then if you get there, there is this beautiful sort of old complex that's a former Brickworks where, as we were saying earlier, the coffee costs $8, right? So,
or you could buy bottles of wine,
or you could buy, yeah, or a $400 chair. And it's a good place, and I don't mean to knock it, but I mean, you see my point. Why is that part of the city that remarkable natural feature? And Toronto has these very deep river valleys and these very deep ravines that
is very rare.
It's rare. It's a special quality of the city, and it's a real thing that other places don't have. And yet, despite, I've been hearing people talk about this for decades, you still can't easily get into them. You can't find your way around. Once you're down there, there aren't the kinds of amenities that we're talking about that make it comfortable to be there.
Which is so interesting, because like wayfinding could be something that the city could implement so easily.
I mean, I was involved in a discussion around the same site, the Evergreen Brickworks, probably close to 10 years ago, a design charrette, a design exercise.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that came out of it, was a plan to do that. And it's only now happening 10 years later, a new proper system of signage, wayfinding, meaning just signs that here's where you are, 1 kilometer that way is this thing, here's a little map. Yeah. This stuff is not complicated, but for whatever reason, the particular kind of mechanisms of government here don't focus on that kind of thing.
Yeah, which is a hindrance to the own establishment and growth of what can be.
1,000%. And, I don't think there's any sort of big, like, philosophical or political reason for that. I just think that, we're talking now about the City of Toronto's Parks Department and how they do capital projects and how they think about the places that they operate. And that's like way down in the bureaucracy, right? I have met the person who's in charge of that group, and, he's trying to affect some change now, but like, that's a small thing. Why is there not better wayfinding? Why isn't there more openness to having cafes and parks? That's not a decision that the mayor of a big city is going to be thinking about, but that's the kind of thing that can happen and costs basically nothing or costs nothing, and makes people's lives better. And as you say, like, serves makes the parks better.
Well, there would be people out there I know for sure that there's wealth within this city that would pay for a project like that to happen.
I think you're right. I mean, there's not a lot of philanthropy in Canada devoted to public space, but we see some examples. The Bentway project, which was created by a family called the Matthews, which is a great, interesting public space. And it does some of the things that we've been talking about as well. It's a public space that has programming, right? There's food. They have a lot of events. They have a little skating trail, and they have skate rentals. The city government can do all those things. Yeah. And sometimes it does, but in this place, it didn't, until somebody came along to say, this particular place needs a thing. It's a very busy place with a lot of new residents, and they need a gathering place, and it needs to have stuff going on. There's nothing there that government is not capable of doing, right? It's just, an attention to a focus on the human experience and a focus on all of the stuff I've been rambling about. Like, what is it that makes being in a city or living in a city fun? What makes it pleasurable?
Yeah.
How do we get that? And we absolutely can deliver those qualities. We're just not asking those questions enough.
So here's the question I ask anyone that's listening to this. If you're listening to this and you have you have a trust that you're like wondering what you should do with it, and you're debating, should I do something for the good of the public? If you're interested, perhaps connect with either Alex or I, and maybe we can find the right people to connect with at the city to make something like wayfinding actually happen that allows people to get a far more immersive experience in the public spaces. Because you just think about that and how amazing it would be to not have to like try to pop open your phone and try to figure out where you are in a trail system to connect to where you want to go.
Yep.
Imagine that there was something physically there that was interesting, made sense for being there, and made your experience better. And it would be fun for like be fun for a family to go and experience that. So I
got a project for a philanthropist who wants it.
Yeah.
And that is the Toronto's old City Hall, very much in line with what you're talking about.
Go for it.
So this is this building that is enormous. It's, for those who understand these numbers, it's 400,000 square feet, and it is empty. It was Toronto City Hall from 1900 until 1965, and then it was a courthouse, and basically nobody has been in there unless they have court business for the last 60 years. And now it's empty, and the city is trying to figure out what to do with it. And a few weeks ago, I published some drawings by some landscape architects, Public Work, a firm who worked on the Bentway, among other things. They are fantastic. I like them a lot, and I love their work. They drew what this place could look like if you took the courtyard of this giant old sort of fortress of a stone building and you livened up the courtyard with a cafe and a stage and some trees and some lighting, and then thought about opening up the building over time to have more connections to the street around it and to this courtyard. And what they were coming up with was, a vision to animate, to use the jargon, to make stuff happen in this building right now. Right. And I think that huge building, which is in the very center of Toronto, next to its City Hall, next to the Eaton Centre shopping mall, should be a multi-purpose cultural center with a lot of different stuff going on. And I think you need to start that right now. And the building is sitting empty, and the city is paying to take care of it. And that should be starting this summer. And there is nothing other than sort of internal politics and bureaucratic infighting that is stopping that from happening. Get it going, open a restaurant to get some revenue coming in, start to bring in some short-term tenants, get, an arts organization like Wavelength to program some music, get it started incrementally, bit by bit, bring the place to life. And again, that's something that the city could do, but is the city going to do that? In Canada, we're not good at that kind of project.
Well, they're not going to invest in it, but they might make it feasible for someone to be able to come along.
They don't even need to invest that much. The kind of vision I'm talking about would cost almost nothing. Right. And that's the crazy thing about it, is that this kind of programming an existing building or programming an existing place comes with costs, but they're not huge costs, right?
And the fact that Public Work would go ahead and create a plan for this, which, again, if you're listening right now, you have to understand that when someone's doing that, they're putting forth time, energy, and resources, capital of their own, to imagine something that has not been asked to be imagined.
That's right.
So if there are practices like that out there that are willing to take on that kind of time and effort, if you had the means and you wanted to do this, you'd likely have some incredible talent to work with to make something really fortunate happen to the city.
I think so. And I think, our philanthropists, we do have generous philanthropists here in English Canada generally, but especially in Toronto, but they tend to focus their work on healthcare, and on higher education and some other things. But if you're going to put out your name on a hospital wing, that's valuable and it's going to help people. But, the amount of public good that you can generate through a project like this, through improving public space, through transforming public space, $5 million, $10 million goes an incredibly long way, for that kind of thing.
And it's also, when you talk about healthcare, there is an element associated with like your mental health and the enjoyment and fulfillment you get of walking into a space. And if you're listening to this, think of a place that you've walked into once in your life that wowed you when you were walking up to the doors and you were expecting something, but you walked in and it was something completely different. Yeah. And if you've experienced that in your life, and there's an opportunity to do that with a historic building in Toronto, it's pretty special that opportunity even exists right now. So just, we'll dangle that out there.
Send me an email. I'll be happy to connect you with the right people. And, these things, I don't have any stake in that. These guys.
This is a stake in the city.
I have a stake in the city. And, the landscape architects, Public Work, they might potentially get a job out of this. But, Mark Ryan, who led that project, is so passionate about Toronto, as he understands, as I do, as so many of us do. I think that, again, being in a city is a good thing. And this city, which I love, has many wonderful qualities and has a lot of creative and interesting and dynamic people, and making places where people can come together in different ways is possible and is going to make us happier. And I would also argue that it's going to make us happier and it's going to bring people together, but I would argue that it generates economic value. And this is the thing with public space that firm. I mean, I argue for a lot of these things from the left, but I think if you are interested in making a dynamic city, what has New York changed in the last 25 years that has made New York more attractive to tech companies and to tourists and for people wanting to live there? New York has added parks. They've added the High Line. They have improved their park system. They have closed streets and created pedestrian plazas. They have essentially improved, beautified their public space network so people can do what you want to do when you go to New York City, which is to go out.
Put on your walking shoes.
That's right. Put on your walking shoes, walk around, see some stuff, see some people.
Smell.
I mean, the High Line.
Taste, all of it. The High
Line's extraordinary. And, it gets critiqued, for some good reasons. It's not, the perfect project. It hasn't solved all problems. But, and it has made some economic changes to the neighborhood that it's in that have not benefited everybody. But it has generated an enormous amount of benefit. I think the overall construction cost of the High Line was $200 million US up to this point, I want to say. And there's an estimate that it's generated 20 times that much in real estate value already. And tourism, that one weird little thing that was, a rail line that only like neighborhood weirdos would, climb up and hang out on, is the first or second tourist attraction in New York City.
Crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, and I was there at the very beginning. I wrote about it the day, even before it opened. And I thought, I think this is going to be pretty successful. I had no idea. I didn't see that. And I don't think anybody really did, right? But everything's complicated. Every city's different. Every case is different. But a great public space where people enjoy spending time and have a sense that, of occasion and have a sense that they're in somewhere special, that is a beautiful thing. And it also has economic payoffs. There is no downside to doing that kind of thing well. There are only upsides and multiple upsides. And, a city and a country that has more generous, welcoming, beautiful public places, that's the place I want to live.
Yeah.
And, I think that's, we've spent a lot of time talking about this now. I mean, that is more than anything else. That's why I do what I do.
Well, I mean, look, the outdoors is... Everybody craves the outdoors, right? I mean, there are those, that want to be hermit crabs and stay inside.
But you need
no
it.
problem.
Yeah.
But when the weather changes and people start showing up outside and going for walks and seeing each other again as neighbors and immersing themselves in the public spaces, I mean, you're geared towards it.
Yep.
Right? Our bodies crave it.
And we can do that inside too. I mean, public spaces can be inside. They should be.
I wasn't intending to only.
No, you're absolutely right. No, I agree on, I'm just saying, yes. And, being inside, we don't have a lot of places for that. But, I was in Montreal a couple of weeks ago to see a building called the Sanok Center, which is a kind of library, children's library, black box theater, social service hub. Yeah. And a beautiful cafe and a bunch of sort of unprogrammed space where people are just, hanging out with their laptops doing work.
I remember you posting this and the images of it.
It's incredible. So, I mean, you have mothers with new babies and you have elderly people and you have university students doing the work. And, all of these people sharing this one space and no one is asking them to leave. No one's asking them to buy anything, but there's a really nice cafe to buy lunch at if you want to. That kind of sort of generous, varied space, I think that's what we need. Parks do that, but we can do that indoors too, working with our libraries and expanding them. We're working with a new sort of thing like what I proposed for Old City Hall. Make public stuff. Don't spend a fortune, but open the doors and, find places for people to, to do that thing that you saw, to see your neighbors, to say hello, to be, to be out in company.
Yeah. Alex, I have, look, this was long anticipated and I have so enjoyed all of this. I really did. Like this whole topic of public space has always been something that I have personally been very, very passionate about. It changes the way you feel when you're experiencing it correctly. So again, thank you for taking time away from what you do for this. And I know we are on somewhat of limited time. And so I really do. I hope you get it, but I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time to go into the depths of these conversations, to share your experience and what you've seen from all over the world. I will also say that if you're listening to this, you can read Alex Alex's opinions. You can read Alex's interests in the globe. He's on LinkedIn. You can see him there. And in addition to that, Alex was also a part of a prologue in what is an incredible initiative called Impossible Toronto. And if you're not familiar with that, I would also highly recommend taking a look. I will have a link to it in the liner notes of today's show, where you'll be able to see, you'll be able to access and see things from Alex, but you'll also be able to see what Impossible Toronto is about, because it's brilliant. And Alex was a part of that from the beginning. So Alex, thank you again. I really appreciate you doing this.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for what you do.